Out of all the video game franchises that have come and gone throughout the years, Medal of Honor is definitely one of the most prominent. A series which is both responsible for popularizing the World War II genre in gaming, and then one that also helped to run it into the ground in the late 2000s. Looking back on it now though, I kinda wonder if new gamers would still appreciate it the same way that we did all those years ago, and I feel like its success is also due in part to the demographic of the people who played it back then. You know, referring to people around a similar age to me, one of the last generations who had grandparents who actually fought in the Second World War. My granddad on my mum's side was an engineer in the Air Force ground crew, and then my granddad on my dad's side was a Sunderland pilot with the RAF, tasked with tracking down and bombing submarines. So maybe in some kind of weird way, I felt like there was more of a connection there to that time period, you know, given we had living relatives who'd been through it all. Either way though, this is one of the key game series that kicked off the popularity of the World War II genre, and just military shooters in general. Without Medal of Honor, we definitely wouldn't have had Call of Duty, and we probably wouldn't have other franchises like Battlefield or Brothers in Arms. So despite where the series ended up, it's kinda hard to deny the impact and the influence it had during those early days. So why don't we talk about it? From 1999 all the way up to 21 years later in 2020. This is the Medal of Honor retrospective.
Care to join us? I guarantee you, it'll be a blast.
Right, so the first game in the series, and the one that kicked the whole thing off, was simply titled Medal of Honor, released way back in 1999 for the PlayStation exclusively. GoldenEye 007 had come out 2 years prior on the Nintendo 64 and really shown the world what console shooters were capable of. And although the PlayStation did have some pretty decent shooters with things like Disruptor, Power Slave, Alien Trilogy, and a pretty damn good port of Doom, it hadn't quite reached the scope there of what Rare was able to pull off. But now that was all about to change, because here comes Medal of Honor, a World War II themed shooter developed by DreamWorks Interactive, even having direct involvement from Steven Spielberg himself, heavily influenced by what the guy did with Saving Private Ryan, along with experiences he'd had watching his son play GoldenEye. The game introduces OSS operative Jimmy Patterson, who is to the Medal of Honor series what Sonic the Hedgehog was to Sega. The silent protagonist you'd take control of as you fought back against the Germans. Yeah, all several hundred of them. The game being on a CD meant that it could also take advantage of the extra storage space, allowing for actual footage from World War II, which they worked into the many briefing screens throughout.
Hundreds of German U-boats were launched to hunt in their deadly wolfbacks.
Now, I'm not sure if I'd call it a run-and-gun shooter, it's more of like a stand-and-gun shooter, because aside from just firing from the hip, the game has a much more precise aiming mode with the crosshair, which is what you'll spend most of the time using. The only thing is, you're going to have to be standing still to use it. It's kind of similar to the manual aiming in GoldenEye, only here it's kind of mandatory because you often can't hit jack shit without it. You can change your control scheme to support the use of both thumbsticks, which makes the whole thing instantly playable in the current year, and part 2 of what I think makes it still stand up in a lot of ways. Weapons involve pistols, rifles, machine guns, and one of the better shotguns in all of gaming. And regardless of the weapon, manual aiming is really the way to go here. As you'd expect for a military shooter, the enemy lineup is pretty simple, mostly just being soldiers armed with similar weapons as the player. That means no cacodemons, no lost souls, or pig cops. Even by today's standards though, the AI for these guys is surprisingly smart. Even though they just mostly stand still and shoot at you, you'll also see them ducking left and right, they'll crouch or go prone to make themselves harder to hit, and if you throw a grenade at them, they'll run away from it or maybe even kick it back, which is kind of impressive to watch. Plus, they'll return the favour, frequently throwing their own grenades, which is often pretty hard to see if they clip through the floor. Bullshit! I do think we kind of take motion captured animations for granted these days, and going back and replaying something like this reminds me of a time when all of this stuff was done by hand. That means you have all of these really exaggerated, over-the-top animations. Even the way they fall to the ground or stagger when shot feels more animated than it needs to be, but then again, that's also part of the game's charm. Even something as simple as being able to shoot the helmet off someone's head or watch them get back to their feet after catching a bullet is just brimming with soul. Plus too, I've always loved the animations for the NPCs when you're showing them your papers. The way they raise their hand to their chin to emphasize that they're processing information.
Your papers are in order.
And of course the way they do that infamous salute.
Can I help you find where you are going, sir?
Even the main menu was memorable, with it being set in that iconic war room, and these polygonal characters walking around in the background doing things arbitrarily to look busy. As for the gameplay, well, the campaign's broken up into 8 missions, and each mission has a bunch of objectives you're going to need to complete, most of which involve shooting people or just blowing stuff up. Stealth missions do offer up a nice alternative, and these involve sneaking around undercover, along with showing your credentials to every goose-stepping moron who stops you in your tracks.
Who's your commanding officer?
And overall, it's still a mostly solid little campaign, though it does start to get a bit cheap near the end when you come up against guys armed with STG-44s and other soldiers armed with rocket launchers. Thankfully though, when they fire those, it's kind of like they're shooting them in slow motion, but all it takes is one hit here and you're killed and have to restart the entire mission from scratch. Yeah, this comes before the common decency of mid-mission checkpoints was like a standard thing, so expect some frustrating restarts. What also really sells the whole package here is the music. The soundtrack and that main theme was composed by Michael Giacchino, who went on to do music for Pixar, Marvel films, and even recently working on the Batman. As a result, the whole thing feels much more epic and cinematic, making the missions feel larger than life, not to mention more memorable. I mean, that little motif that's used for the Germans that just keeps popping up is something that's just still burned into my brain. Plus, it also has phenomenal sound work. The second mission in the game has you escaping through the sewers, and as you're moving through this dark network of tunnels, you can hear whistles being blown, German soldiers shouting, and dogs barking off in the distance as you're being hunted down. The weapons all sound pretty great too, capturing the more realistic and true-to-life aspect that they're trying to go for. And about all they buggered up here is that you can reload the M1 Garand at any time, as opposed to having to empty the entire clip beforehand and hearing that iconic ping. Keep in mind though, this is when the gaming demographic was mostly comprised of kids and teenagers, not 30-something-year-old man-children who've never fired a gun in their life and base all of their weapon expertise off what they read on Wikipedia. Playing it now in 2022, I do think it's a bit of a product of its time, and playing it again for this video, it does remind me that you're playing something made back in 1999. But I think regardless, it's still a pretty damn good game, man, that really set the benchmark for countless shooters it followed. And it is really one of the first of its kind for that military shooter genre. I think the only other World War II themed first-person shooter we'd had before this was World War II GI, which ran on the Build engine, but that thing felt more like a total conversion for Duke Nukem 3D than its own thing, not to mention it felt like shit. Medal of Honor, however, laid the foundation for what would follow, and in a lot of ways, everything that came out afterwards was just kind of building upon what they'd created with this first iteration.
Your papers are in order.
Now, they didn't really wait too long here to capitalize on its popularity, releasing the sequel, Medal of Honor Underground, barely a year later in 2000. Yeah man, back at a time when developers could make an entire game in a span of about 12 months. In Underground, you're playing as French Resistance member Manon Baptiste, who actually popped up a fair bit in the first game, only this time there's an entire campaign focused on her. It's actually a pretty big moment for the FPS genre too here, with Manon being one of the earliest examples of a female protagonist, and one that even the NPCs in the game acknowledge at times.
Nice credentials.
Pretty badass one too, man, going up against the Germans and almost single-handedly fucking up their entire operations on a global scale. I'd rather hear both sides of the tale. It's also kind of a prequel to the first game, showing how Manon initially started working with the OSS. Prior to that, she was just carrying out solo missions for the Resistance with her brother in Paris, before this guy got killed when an operation went awry. The second mission has you escaping through the catacombs after his death, which is not only awesome, but one of the many environments here based off real-world locations. Also, it's the first time you get to use the Sten SMG, one of Underground's many new weapons, and there's just something so fun here about mowing down Germans with a gun that's made out of like $10 worth of materials. After that though, you're working with the OSS for the rest of the campaign, given your orders from the same CO that gave Jimmy his.
Which brings us to the subject of your next assignment.
And you'll start to see that Underground really is about as close to a perfect sequel as you could ever really want. And the reason for that is because it just builds upon what made the first game so good. I mean, for starters, visually, the game has much more variety, getting outside of Europe and going to other countries like Africa and Greece. Even just the backdrop of the Paris catacombs sticks out amongst the median villages and forests you explored in the first game. Missions are also often much more action-packed, throwing way more enemies at you during combat, making the whole thing more challenging but also more exciting. I mean, damn dog, it's only 3 missions in and you're already blowing up tanks with a Panzerschreck. You'll visit locations like Casablanca and Crete. Is it Crete or Crete? And at one point it's like you're playing Wolfenstein 3D or something, going through these eerie German castles, collecting Nazi relics, along with shooting a bunch of guys wearing suits of armor. For one mission you're escorting a captain as he releases POWs, and then during a later mission you're riding shotgun in a motorbike, shooting at passing soldiers with a machine gun. The final mission even takes place during the liberation of Paris in 1944 as the resistance makes a final stand against the Germans. You'll see actual Paris landmarks too, like Notre Dame, the Eiffel Tower, and even Moulin Rouge. For one part of this mission there's not even any music, just the distant, diegetic sound of a lady singing in German coming out of a radio, along with the ambience of nearby shootouts echoing throughout the empty city streets. It's just a vibe. And it's a really good example of an old game working within the limitations of a platform, but still pulling off this really cool atmosphere. Now, I already mentioned one of the new weapons is that Sten submachine gun, but then there's also a crossbow, and my personal favourite, the STG-44. Hands down one of my all-time favourite World War II guns, and a much better alternative to the bar and that tiny-ass 20-round magazine. Yeah, when you absolutely positively got to execute every motherfucker in the room, except no substitutes. Apart from that, you've also got a petrol bomb, because nothing screams guerrilla warfare more than throwing a glass bottle full of highly flammable liquid at the troops of a totalitarian military force. Fuck, man, say that sentence 5 times fast. They've also expanded upon the stealth sections from the first game. This time you go undercover as a photographer, even able to use that camera to take photographs of the Germans, who will often strike these fancy poses, which is pretty funny to watch.
I assume someone approved this.
The campaign comes to an end with a level set on a train, the best kind of levels, where you cause 2 oncoming trains to collide with each other on the same track, which is a pretty cool way to end the whole thing. But the most memorable thing about the whole experience is its final epilogue, which as you playing as Jimmy Patterson again in a spin-off mission, that as you go into a mysterious castle to investigate these top secret experiments. This involves getting through 3 challenging levels where you'll take on dancing German shepherds armed with machine guns, along with guys in suits of armor, zombies that explode, and then for the final level, life-size nutcrackers. You can't make this shit up. The goal of these 3 levels is to find the components to craft something called the Panzerknacker, which is your very own weaponized nutcracker that's gonna help you make your escape. But let me see if I've got this straight, right? Your plan is to break into this place to find the components to build something to help you escape. Makes sense? But you know what? The whole thing is just so cheesy and tongue-in-cheek that you can almost overlook just how dumb it is. It's a perfect, light-hearted way here to wrap the whole thing up, plus also giving you a serious little final challenge here to punch through. Overall, Medal of Honor Underground was a great swan song for this series on the PlayStation, and all of these years later, still one of the best for the platform, hands down.
No!
That can't be said about the Game Boy Advance version, and I guess it'd be remiss of me to not mention this abomination at least once. And yeah, I'm kind of jumping ahead a bit here to late 2002, but it is worth mentioning if only to get the whole thing out of the way nice and early. Medal of Honor Underground for the Game Boy Advance might honestly be the worst FPS game I think I've ever played. And I suppose you could say it's impressive they got the whole thing running on a Game Boy, but that's kind of negated when you consider how awful it is to actually play through. It kind of encapsulates the phrase, just because you can doesn't mean you should. It actually follows the mission structure of the PlayStation version pretty closely, beginning with Manon and her brother in Paris, along with that whole escape sequence through the catacombs, before she then starts working for the OSS. It even has those missions undercover with a film camera, killing German archaeologists and finding all those relics. But the whole thing is just so incredibly unfun due to how the whole thing looks and plays. And I mean, just looking at it in motion should be evidence enough here, but let me elaborate. For starters, let's talk about how the enemy sprites are barely distinguishable from the background, and look at the weapon sprites too and how basic they are. Looking at the whole thing from a distance, it's like staring into a magic eye puzzle that you just can't solve.
Keep your eyes unfocused. Then
Oh, yeah! As for the gameplay, well, you don't do much more here than just hold down the shoot button on that small gathering of pixels which are supposed to be enemy soldiers until you hear their death rattle. And is it me, or are these guys saying sounds good when you shoot them? I mean, listen to this and tell me if I'm going crazy or not.
Shots good, shots good. Shots good, shots good. Shots good.
As for the music, well, that is also pretty awful and a bit of an insult to the Game Boy's sound chip. But if you want to go a bit deeper, just compare this thing to other Game Boy ports. Something like Wolfenstein 3D, Duke Nukem, or Doom. And then consider the ports of almost 10-year-old games somehow looks, runs, and play better than this does. What's even worse though is that this doesn't even have the common decency to get itself over with quickly. Yeah man, it's like a 4 or so hour long game. And most of that time will just be spent trying to navigate the environment. Finally, consider that this was also a full-priced game as well. I mean, just let that sink in. Yeah, imagine charging that kind of money for something that's more or less a goddamn slideshow. In fact, you know what? I take that back. That's a bit of an insult to slideshows. The most shocking part is that this thing was developed by Rebellion, who of course worked on the Sniper Elite series, along with some other pretty solid shooters like Judge Dredd vs. Death and the AVP games. So this thing is a bit of a painful, pixelated blip on what was otherwise a damn solid portfolio. However, that wasn't the final game we got for the Game Boy Advance, because after this in 2003, again, yeah, jumping ahead, we got Medal of Honor Infiltrator. But whereas Underground failed as a crappy attempt at a first-person shooter, Infiltrator succeeds at being a pretty damn good top-down shooter. Yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually like this. I mean, check it out, man, they've even managed to include those briefing screens, even though I'm guessing it's not much more than animated GIFs, along with having a low-quality rendition of the theme tune and actual music during the missions that won't make your ears or your ass bleed. Plus, it also has that infamous EA intro animation.
EA games.
What you've got here is a pretty fun little shooter with vertically scrolling environments and a bunch of mission objectives to complete, even starting off with its very own beach landing. Almost like the kind of thing you'd expect to see back in the day on Newgrounds. You can shoot in 8 different directions to take out enemies, and holding down the right shoulder button is going to lock you in that direction, allowing you to essentially strafe left and right. There's different weapon loadouts with the Thompson submachine gun, the bar rifle, and the M1 Garand, which I think is by far the best. And they've even managed to work in some stealth sequences where you can choose to stay out of the enemy's line of sight and sneak up behind them for a bunch of takedowns. Combined with these really fun intermissions inside a first-person perspective, shooting at shit with a machine gun and unlimited ammo, which kind of reminds me of old arcade shooters like Operation Wolf. All mixed together with some really charming pixel art in the same vein as the Metal Slug games. You even get to hop into a tank a few times and drive around blowing stuff up and running people over. It's actually a pretty astute comparison to make too, considering that like the Metal Slug games, Infiltrator is often ball-crushingly hard. You know, as in, it's gonna crush your balls. But along with being able to save your progress and there being a bunch of unlockables and side objectives to complete, I feel like the difficulty just adds to that replayability factor. Making this something that you actually want to replay, compared to Underground where I'd rather have my asshole hairs plucked out with a scorpion bar. So if Underground was a disappointing entree for the series' first entry on a handheld platform, well then Infiltrator was like the satisfying main course. Yeah, good shit.
Good job.
Right, so at this point we're going to jump back to 2002 when the series finally made its way to the PC, but more importantly the 6th generation consoles, with 2 games coming out in close proximity. These being Medal of Honor Allied Assault and then Medal of Honor Frontline. And while Frontline on the consoles feels like a successor to the first 2 games, Allied Assault on the PC is a little bit different and much more run and gun. This time you're not playing as Jimmy Patterson either, it's Mike Powell, as opposed to playing as Mike Roch or Mike Hunt. This version was developed by 2005 Inc., whose only other real notable credit, apart from Allied Assault, is the expansion pack for Sin. I think most people would say that Allied Assault is one of, if not the best game in the series, and while I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, I do think if nothing else, it's the most accessible, and it is still highly playable on PC. The campaign starts off pretty slowly here with a boring escort quest at night time, which just seems to go on and on. Then there's a bit of a difficulty spike with the second mission when you go undercover in Norway to steal intel and destroy a German U-boat. What I find increasingly more annoying here though every time I play through this thing is the flinching when you get shot at, and this might be the worst example of it I've ever seen in an FPS game. And that kind of brings me on to my main criticism. Allied Assault has the enemy count and the player health pool of a run and gun shooter, but then weirdly enough it has the movement speed, the reload and the weapon swap time of a tactical shooter. It's just missing the most important tactical shooter elements like being able to lean and go prone. Yet don't even get me started on the pathetic jumping height. That means it's kinda like this weird mix of gameplay elements from the prior games combined with the faster paced shooting elements from other shooters at the time, most notably Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which came out a year prior. And it's kinda like the developers just couldn't decide what kind of game they were making. The AI seems to teeter between being completely oblivious to then having actual intelligence, which means you'll see them do things like ignoring live grenades, for instance, but then on the other hand, you'll see them doing things like jumping on one to protect their buddies. I don't know, I guess my point now is that playing it in 2023, it's not really going to be worth it for the gameplay alone. Instead, I think Allied Assault is only really memorable now for three main reasons. Firstly, the D-Day mission, which along with the one in Frontline was really one of the first times we've ever had this sequence recreated in a video game. Ignoring of course World War II GI, which everyone should. Undoubtedly influenced by that opening scene in Saving Private Ryan, it's again this incredibly intense set piece where you're one of the many poor souls here sent to Normandy only to be greeted by machine gun nests that barely let you get your toes wet, let alone make your way up the beach and complete your objective. And it still serves its purpose as being this insanely hard mission, where it's almost kind of blatant in how crushing they're making it, probably to kind of highlight how impossible the situation really would have been for those guys in real life. I still remember playing this mission on my dad's computer for the first time, and really thinking that this was the best that video game graphics were ever going to get. By today's standards, it does kind of look dated, but the sound design I think still really holds up. And the explosions and gunfire combined with having your orders bucked at you from your commanding officer makes this whole sequence super visceral and overwhelming.
Covering fire!
It also runs on the Quake 3 engine, which felt a lot like it was the go-to engine for shooters at the time. Much in the same way that everyone seems to jump onto the Unreal Engine nowadays, without having a fucking clue in how to make that engine not look and run like total shit. So yeah, dog, if you're playing Allied Assault for this mission alone, well, you're not going to be disappointed. The second thing which makes Allied Assault so memorable is Sniper Town, which is one of the best and the worst levels in the entire game. I say it's the best level because, again, like the D-Day one, it just has this insane atmosphere, forcing you to move through a sniper-infested village with a tank crew in the middle of a heavy rainstorm. Shutters on the windows bang loudly against the buildings, planes periodically fly over you in the midst of these unseen dogfights, and the rain and thunder's like this ever-present obstruction, making it even more difficult to make out the would-be assassins hiding off in the distance. It's just a masterclass in sound design and ambience. But then it's also the worst mission because of just how irritating it is to get through. And it ain't really a mission based off skill, it's more a mission about just knowing where all of these assholes are hiding. As a rule of thumb, the snipers in the game are always just complete pricks, and they always put these guys in really well hidden spots, which, yeah, I get it makes sense, they're snipers, but it's kind of frustrating from a gameplay perspective when you don't know where they are or where you're getting hit from. There's one early on in the game who's hiding behind a bunch of trees, and you literally cannot see him, like, at all. So, dealing with one sniper can be a headache, so yeah, imagine being in an entire village that's teeming with them. This level right here is the reason that save scumming exists, and although I've finished this game probably like a dozen times, I still struggle with this mission, and I always forget where at least one or two of these assholes are hiding. Then finally, the third reason Allied Assault is memorable are barrels. Yeah, that's right, son, you heard me. Barrels. Barrels which, when you shoot, dynamically leak oil depending on the point you shoot them at. You still see people pointing this out on the internet even decades later, and yeah, it's a cool little piece of tech. In a game that's otherwise set in a world where every object may as well be made out of concrete. I still do think Allied Assault is a decent game, and the inclusion of all those stealth missions is again a pretty cool addition. It even has a bit of a throwback to Medal of Honor Underground when you get to meet up with Manon again.
You didn't have too much trouble getting here, I hope.
But I think the issue with playing it now though is that everything it does, Call of Duty does better. The first Call of Duty in 2003 was even worked on by people who formerly worked on the Medal of Honor games, who then splintered off like a splinter and formed Infinity Ward. And everything that introduced the Call of Duty series would completely surpass everything that Medal of Honor had done up until that point, with new control options like leaning left and right or aiming down sights, but then more than that, just making the missions way more exciting, and adding in more NPCs to heighten the feeling of being in an actual war, you know, instead of just being a one-man army. Medal of Honor really sticking to its guns in having you play as American soldiers was also part of its biggest downfall. Call of Duty, on the other hand, lets you play as Pommies, Russians, Canadians, and even Polish soldiers. So while Allied Assault might still have a couple of memorable missions, Call of Duty has like half a dozen of them. They did work on 2 expansion packs here eventually with Spearhead and Breakthrough, and yeah, both of these are still pretty damn good, but they don't really expand too much upon the basic loop of the base game. Allied Assault is just one of those unfortunate titles that came out during that period where PC shooters were really on the cusp of making that next big leap, and it really does kind of suffer for it. Frontline, on the other hand, was released in 2002 and developed again by DreamWorks after they got bought out by Electronic Arts and became EA Los Angeles. And this right here is the true sequel to the first game, letting you play once again as Sonny Jimmy Patterson, back again doing what he does best. We can definitely say that this guy's good at his job.
He's better than good. He's a fucking liability.
Frontline often incorrectly gets labelled as just being the same as Allied Assault but on consoles, and this couldn't be further from the truth, because outside of them both having their own D-Day missions, they're completely different games. In Allied Assault, D-Day wasn't until about an hour or so into the game, but in Frontline, it's the opening mission, which to be honest is really what Allied Assault should have done too. Plus, I'd even argue in some ways that this one is almost better than the PC version. For starters, it's way more cinematic, having this really chilling sequence at the beginning when Jimmy gets knocked underwater and sees the floating corpses of his squad mates getting torn up by machine gun bullets. Some of the other effects like the explosions and the water I also think look better on the console despite the lower texture resolution and the image clarity. But more than that, I think the stakes just feel higher because you have to do the whole thing in one go. Yeah, because unlike the PC, there's no quick saves. And this is still one of those console games where you don't get a single checkpoint and you're expected to finish entire levels without dying. It's not too bad for the rest of the game, but storming the beaches of Normandy without dying is a pretty tall order.
Get over here!
A later mission has you sneaking around a town at night time, disabling a bunch of German vehicles, then driving to the next area and repeating it again. Multiple times. And then after you've done all of that, you have to sneak into a bar full of German soldiers and start a bar fight. Not exactly like a train-spotting bar fight either.
Yes!
Apparently a bar fight just means a minimum of 2 people punching each other. But look, my point is that having to do all of this in a single sitting is definitely a bit of a challenge. And the length of some of these missions is much longer than the original games, making Frontline I think one of the tougher entries in the series. Funnily enough though, I think the hardest level in the game is actually one of the shortest, where you have to make your way through this armoured train, bottlenecked into being shot at from a singular direction, plus being stalked from the other side of the tracks by a pursuing carriage that's armed with a cannon. That's not to say it's a bad campaign though, in fact it's actually kind of shocking how well this one still holds up, with smooth controls and visuals that are still pretty decent considering the time it came out. Once again, you're better off using manual aim when shooting and going for the headshots, and the enemies still show off some pretty clever AI, again picking up and throwing back grenades. There are times though when they'll just stand around like idiots, but most of the time they're reactive and show off the kind of clunky, exaggerated movements which can only come from handmade animations. The increased power of the 6th generation consoles removes the really limited draw distance as well, making for some better looking environments, though it does lack the variety that Medal of Honor Underground had. For some reason too, they removed the War Room as the main menu, which is just downright sacrilegious. One thing I did kind of appreciate though was being able to see actual civilians during missions, which adds a much more realistic element to the game. You almost kind of forget that there were millions of people's lives affected during the war, and coming across all of these poor farmers being intimidated by German soldiers, or having to burst into the kitchen of a room full of defenseless women kind of reminds you of that. I think my main issue with Frontline is just the lack of stealth sections. The first few games had these really fun stealth levels, where you spend all of that time sneaking around undetected. Here though, I think there's like 2 stealth areas in the entire game, and for both of them, almost right after using your forged papers, your cover is instantly blown.
Uniform ist falsch. Du bist kein Uniform.
Sneaking around felt like a big component to what being an OSS operative was about, so to have the whole thing downplayed here just feels like a massive step backwards. They also fucked up the shotgun in this thing big time, and that's a damn shame, dog, considering how good it was in the last few games.
Why won't you die?
Otherwise though, there's not really that much here to fault with Frontline, and it definitely justified the purchase of a PlayStation 2, a GameCube, or an Xbox back in the day, that's for damn sure. Hopefully Xbox, because that's the platform this thing seems to run the best on. Now, this was one of the last video games that I ever got to play with my dad. He's not dead, by the way, but I remember him giving up after dying on that D-Day mission for the 20th time, and I think he had started to realize that games were getting to that point where we had to start putting some serious effort into learning how to play them. Despite it filtering mild man though, Frontline is one of the best of the 6th generation shooters, and if you're only going to check out one game in this entire list, well, this is the one. If only to see how many times you get your ass handed to you on the beaches of Normandy.
He's a fucking liability.
After this, there were another 2 games made which dealt with a similar theme, with Medal of Honor Rising Sun and Pacific Assault. And much in the same way as Frontline and Allied Assault tried to recreate that infamous beach landing at Normandy, Rising Sun on the consoles and Pacific Assault on the PC tried to recreate the attack on Pearl Harbor. This time too, we're finally out of Europe and thrust into the Pacific War, in locations like Hawaii, the Philippines, Singapore, and Burma. Now, I still remember seeing the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor movie in cinemas with my mates before this game came out, so you can bet your bottom dollar that I was pretty damn excited to actually get to play this with my own hands. And as it should be, that's how Rising Sun kicks off, with you playing as Corporal Joe Griffin in the bowels of the USS California as it's under attack by the Imperial Navy on that infamous day. You make a desperate scramble to reach the surface, putting out fires and helping your buddies before you finally get topside and witness what's definitely one of the more memorable moments in the entire series. Seeing this slowed down slice of pure pandemonium as you see the true extent and devastation of the assault. Yeah man, gone are the dreary streets of Paris or the secluded roadways of some French village, you're now outside in broad daylight. The sky blackened with smoke and the deafening sound of approaching aircraft overhead combined with thunderous gunfire. It's about as far removed visually from the previous games as you could ever possibly get, and for an opening mission, it's kinda hard to fault. The only thing is that Rising Sun kinda plays its hand a bit too soon here, and the missions that come after this are kind of anticlimactic, because right after this you're in the streets of some village off in the Philippines, armed with an M1 Garand and a Thompson submachine gun shooting indiscriminate looking enemies off in the distance. Eventually moving through so many jungle environments that you somehow manage to contract malaria in real life. Still though, it does bring some pretty notable improvements to the gameplay, one being the inclusion of a dedicated grenade throwing button, which is actually a god tier new addition. And then weirdly, something they removed for every game afterwards. But more than that, being able to actually save your progress during missions. And this alone makes the game way less frustrating because you don't have to replay entire missions from scratch anymore. It also adds in new weapons in the form of a Sten submachine gun, a silenced pistol, along with the other kind of weapons you'd expect to see in the Pacific Theatre. So sadly, no STG-44s or MP-40s. A big criticism you used to always hear about this one was how the game looked worse than Frontline, and I gotta say, I don't think that's entirely true. I think the issue there is that most people only remember those first few missions after Pearl Harbor, which all take place in the jungle at night time, and yeah, that ain't doing the game any favors. It also came out at a point where I just don't think they'd really nailed how to properly render jungles in video games yet, especially in 3D engines. This came out a few months before the first Far Cry did, which would really pioneer the way that jungle environments looked in video games. Not to mention setting a really high benchmark with lots of dense foliage and dynamic lighting, making you feel like you were really right there under the trees, swatting mosquitoes away. Rising Sun is a console-only game, which means it's working within console engine limitations, and yeah, these starting areas just don't look very good. The short view distance is probably done to try to make the areas seem more imposing, but it just makes it look muted and flat. However, it's not all that bad, and later on when you start moving through those jungle environments during the daytime, there is some pretty good looking locations. Kind of impressive too how they've steered away from just copy pasting the same looking trees and grass over and over. Some of the other environments also look really good, like the ones where you're inside all of these Burmese temples, with these accurately modelled Buddha statues is really impressive. There's even a nice attention to detail here with those statues having had all the gold chipped off them, and this is something that actually went down at the time, with the Japanese soldiers salvaging whatever they could find. Apparently the dev team went to all these places in real life to study these locations as much as possible and, you know, keep them feeling true to life. And I think that's one of the aspects that really gets carried over into the gameplay. There are some other standouts in the campaign too, like watching someone get eaten by an alligator. Later on, you get into the back of a tuk-tuk when you're in Singapore, which almost immediately crashes. And funny thing too is that that's how most tuk-tuk rides in real life end up as well. Yeah, in a horrific crash that nearly kills everyone involved. You also get to team up with Aussie soldiers at one point, and that is just hilarious. I mean, coming across Australians in video games is so rare, you have to savor every instance.
Hey, we saw your mates land up ahead. Come with us, we'll take you there.
That's a bloody outrage, it is!
The one and only stealth mission in the game involves you sneaking into this hotel undercover as a German officer, and this is pretty awesome too. Ending in the meeting you're infiltrating being ambushed by your buddy who bursts through a glass ceiling. Even later on, there's a whole mission centered around the bridge on the River Kwai, involving you having to blow the damn thing up. Along with having to ride on the back of a goddamn elephant that's kitted out with machine guns. So, yeah, dare anyone to say that there's nothing memorable about all of this. So whilst it might have one of the lowest aggregate review scores out of every game in the entire franchise, I just think that's because it had to follow Frontline and the expectations that that thing set. I appreciate the change in tone in the premise, not to mention the very distinct Japanese soldiers as the new enemy faction. Those bonsai charges are fucking real, and it's kinda terrifying to think that those guys did that in real life with complete disregard for their own personal safety.
That's a bloody outrage, it is!
Now, Pacific Assault, much like Allied Assault, was exclusive to the PC, and it's actually one of the few times that Michael Giacchino didn't do the music, with someone named Christopher Lennertz doing it instead, creating this really emotive and poignant theme to replace the series' iconic anthem. They've even brought back the War Room as the main menu. I mean, kind of, it's like a makeshift camp on a beach somewhere, but you know what? I'll take it.
Take it! Time out!
Pacific Assault is also one of the few games in the series to try to actually tell an overarching story, with you playing as a guy named Thomas Conlon and the narrative trying to develop the relationships he has between the other guys in his squad.
Jimmy Sullivan's a corpsman from Illinois who dropped out of med school to join the Navy. I get the feeling he comes from money, but none of that matters where we are.
And all of that would be fine, except this game probably came out a bit too early for that kind of thing to be believable.
I remember asking the recruitment officer, "What's the deal with you guys?" I swear to God, he looked right through me and he said, "Deal? We're Marines, son, and we deal in lead."
Oh, this is terrible.
Facial animations weren't entirely at the point yet where they were passable, at least not in this engine anyway, and they've clearly not motion captured the other animations either, which is fine, but it means you get these very wooden cinematics which don't really sell the tone or the mood they're trying to go for.
It's been a long time since I've seen a face like that. She's real pretty, man.
The whole tutorial section of the game is a flashback to when Tommy was at boot camp, and it's the expected diatribe of this drill sergeant shouting at you and calling you names like dirtbag and maggot, because apparently every boot camp level in a video game has to copy Full Metal Jacket.
Am I right?
Only it lacks all the kind of dialogue that made those scenes so memorable. I mean, the drill instructor in Pacific Assault has a speech that goes on for like 2 minutes, and it is just awful.
In the beginning was God. All else was darkness. So God created the heavens and the earth.
Not really helped by the cringy reaction shots of Conlon and his buddies.
God was not happy.
It's supposed to make you become more attached to these guys, I guess, but they never die during missions anyway, outside of scripted moments, so I just never really gave two shits about any of them. But what really makes Pacific Assault kind of weird is how it's this odd mix of like a tactical shooter and a more casual one. This means you've got mechanics like leaning left and right along with aiming down sights, which is the first time this was introduced into the series. Single fire weapons in the game are kind of flat out awful because of the reload time, making the semi-automatic weapons just far more useful. Then there's the option to give your squad basic orders like advancing, retreating, regrouping, or laying down suppressive fire.
Move up!
None of which really seem to matter though, because these guys are joined at the hip to Conlon anyway, so you never really need to worry about them. But by far the worst mechanic is how the healing works. Now, Pacific Assault all but does away with medkits and those magical water canteens from the previous games, so your main way to stay alive here is by having the squad medic Jimmy rush over and fix you up on the fly. That's as simple as pressing a button on the keyboard, at which point this guy will ideally beeline straight towards you, and instead of being outright killed when your health is knocked off, there's a chance he can get you and revive you if you're knocked down. But it's all just kinda crappy.
I got a few more and I'm out, buddy.
For starters, the healing animation is really slow, with Jimmy even throwing up during this animation early on, throwing up so much that it's amazing he hasn't passed out from dehydration. Secondly though, half the time you just get killed. Jimmy doesn't even manage to get you before you're killed by a nearby Japanese soldier. When this happens, you just kind of sit there staring at the abyss, slowly creeping in around you, hoping this guy's gonna make it, only to see a nearby enemy come up and finish you off before he even has the chance. I do think it's kind of a neat idea how the further you get into the game, the more efficient he becomes, but it's just a slow, clunky mechanic. And there's a reason why no other game in the series has ever done this. You wanna know why? Because it sucks. Pacific Assault also, much like Rising Sun, takes its own bayonet stab at the Pearl Harbor attack. This version starts off with you getting a tour of the base from another officer, introducing you to all of these random people that you'll never meet again, but doing a good job of establishing how many people were stationed on the base that day.
Rest of the area is mostly the submarine base. Yeah, those bubbleheads kind of keep to themselves, you know? It's being cooped up like that all the time.
Then the attack happens, and you're just trying to make it to a nearby gunship, avoiding all of these planes doing strafing runs. You'll have to again move around inside a sinking ship, trying to rescue your fellow Marines, followed by again getting topside, shooting down approaching planes, before another sequence in a gunship, similar to the console version where you shoot down, yet again, a bunch more enemy planes. Overall though, it's a pretty intense mission and reminds you just how catastrophic that this event was. It's also arguably one of the most important events because this attack essentially instigated what we now refer to as World War II. But again, after that, much like Rising Sun, you'll just spend most of the time here going through jungles, swamps, and more jungles.
Let's move up, fellas!
Trading shots with Japanese soldiers who pretty much just blend into the background, with mission objectives being little more than just moving forward and shooting enemies, you know, among a few others, like this. Lift Willy. And like Rising Sun, it also makes the same mistake, kicking off with a jungle level set in the middle of the goddamn night, where you couldn't even see your own dick if you wanted to stop to take a piss. I do think visually this game still looks pretty good though, and the jungle areas during the daytime perfectly encapsulate what I was talking about earlier with Rising Sun, how they've managed to pull off a believable and dense jungle environment. The water effects still look great, and you've even got dynamic lighting coming in from the trees, casting shadows across your hands and your weapon as it's filtered through the leaves. It also makes those bonsai charges even more harrowing, because you often can't see these guys until they're really bearing down on you. I guess the only question is, like, how long can you shoot the same looking enemies in the same looking jungle before it just starts to get boring? That's kind of the issue with both of these games, is that outside of the Pearl Harbor attack, there's not really that many well-known battles that took place in the Pacific Theater. Certainly not as notable anyway as Pearl Harbor. Unless of course you're the kind of person who's really into World War II history and knows every single engagement. About halfway through the game, they try to recreate the Battle of the Ridge, which was a 2-day-long assault from the Japanese as the US tried to defend an airfield. And that might sound good on paper, but in a video game, all you're really doing is shooting the same looking people over and over in the same small patch of jungle. And it's doubly crappy here because it seems you're the only person actually killing anyone. Kind of shows too how these large-scale missions in war games only really work if the AI is lending a helping hand. If you're the only person doing something, then it just turns you into the one-man army, single-handedly repelling an entire assault and completely removing the realistic angle they're trying to take in the first place. During this sequence, it's common to see your allies overrun, because these guys couldn't even hold the line against a handful of enemies, and you'll have to jump out of whatever hole you're hiding in to help them repeatedly.
Someday you will tell your sons how you fought with courage at a place called Bloody Ridge.
Yeah, and I'm sure they all referred to it as Bloody Ridge 5 minutes after the battle was over. Sure.
God bless the Corps!
I will say one thing though, and that's the Pacific Assault doesn't have a level where you're having to go through some area that's been infested with snipers, because you know they could have easily put that kind of level in. It would have been an absolute nightmare like Sniper Town if it ever contracted jungle fever and AIDS at the same time. So just thank God that they had the mercy to not include a sequence like that. Instead, they included a level that's a complete genre shift, putting you in a plane and throwing you into dogfights with the Japanese because, yeah, apparently Conlin's also an expert pilot. This plane controls exactly how I'd expect a plane to control when it's flown by someone who has bugger all experience, and it's by far the worst mission in the entire game. At one point you need to bomb these enemy ships, and all it made me want to do is bomb the house of the person who designed this ship. Overall, Pacific Assault kind of feels like it was trying to experiment with where to take this series from that point on, kind of making it a bit of a black sheep for the franchise. I do think there's a reason why EA literally gave this game away for free though, so if you do want to play it, well, at least you're not wasting anything, aside from your time, which, come on, we both know is worthless. But it is the last time I'm going to be on the PC for 3 or so years, and where things go from here is what marks the beginning of the end for the series.
Oh, you're a cocky little son of a bitch. I've put up with your crap since boot camp.
Because what came after Pacific Assault is what I like to call the creatively bankrupt period for the Medal of Honor franchise. And we got a bunch of games between 2005 and 2007, most of which just didn't do anything all that different or exciting. I mean, the World War II genre was fully established by this point, with Call of Duty, Brothers in Arms, and the Company of Heroes series not too far off either. So to say that we were starting to get World War II fatigue is a bit of an understatement. And the games that followed for the Medal of Honor series was European Assault, Heroes 1 and 2, Vanguard, and then Airborne, all set during the Second World War.
Those sons of bitches!
The first one was European Assault, coming out in 2005 for the Xbox, the PS2, and the GameCube, with 4 campaigns to play through in France, North Africa, Belgium, and then even the Soviet Union. Yeah, this one breaks new ground, being the first time in the series you get to go to Russia, with 2 whole missions set in Stalingrad. Even Best Girl Manon shows up later in the game when you have to rescue her from a farmhouse, making it the first time she's been seen in any of these games since Frontline.
Come on, let's go!
Apart from that though, it's a pretty forgettable experience playing as a completely interchangeable character named William Holt as he regales us with stories about his escapades during the war. The gameplay feels like it's taken a few pointers from Pacific Assault, focusing more on cover-based shooting, leaning left and right, and hiding behind waist-high objects. In fact, early on, you're flat out told to stay behind cover and not play this as a run and gun shooter. And the controls do work pretty well in that way, becoming almost essential to survive. You get medkits which restore a portion of your health, but also player revives which are earned by completing main and side objectives. Side objectives being things like finding intel, killing high-ranked German officers, or destroying extra assets. So it almost encourages you to complete these side tasks to make sure you've got a fighting chance.
Hey! Over here!
And it all sounds good, right? You know, almost like a bit of a throwback to the earlier games where you had to take your time and use precise aim, trading shots back and forth with the opposition. Only, it doesn't really work out that well because enemies don't seem to play by the same rules. This is a semi-tactical game with a really fast time to kill, only someone didn't tell the enemies that, and these guys move around like they're playing Quake 3 Arena. I mean, damn dog, you die so quickly here that those revives almost become mandatory to make it through those tougher missions. To make the shooting even more odd, the pickups for health and ammo are these giant floating icons that look like something out of a completely different game. Oh, and the dumbest thing too is how those icons vanish if you don't get them fast enough. And that just promotes the complete opposite of how you've been taught to play the game. Because you have to play aggressive to get to these in time, but this is also the same game where playing aggressively gets you killed. So yeah, great idea, dickheads. It means you'll be scrimping by on ammo quite a lot here, and I don't know if that was by design to make you really have to work for every kill, but the high enemy count sure doesn't lead me to believe that. Nah man, I think the truth is just someone fucked up. Then to make it even weirder, there's an adrenaline mechanic where you can go invincible and get like infinite ammo for 10 or so seconds, which is about as far removed from tactical shooting as you can possibly get. So overall, it's like a weird mix of different elements that just don't quite gel. The worst thing are your teammates though, who do absolutely nothing to help you out and only get in the way constantly.
Hello.
Imagine the resistance members from the City 17 chapters in Half-Life 2 and then double that annoyance factor and you're almost there. Just thank God there's no friendly fire in this game, or it would have been court-martialed before I even finished the prologue. They're supposed to be able to help out during combat, and you can even send them to a specific location or call them back in, neither of which though are all that useful. The other issue is that the A button is bound to multiple actions here. It's bound to reloading, it's bound to interacting with stuff, but it's also bound to heal your teammates using one of your available medkits. So yeah, take a guess what happens when you're trying to reload or activate something when these idiots are constantly running in front of you. On a positive note, there is some pretty good variety to the missions here with all the various areas you travel to, and it does look decent for a console game from that era. I gotta say too, I'm a sucker for a level set in the snow, and this game has some pretty good looking snow levels. Other than that though, this one really has nothing going for it, and its short length, which comes in at around 4 hours, is probably the best thing about it. I'm likely to respect a subpar game if it at least has consideration for my time, so yeah, I can't fault it in that regard. Now after this, we're going handheld again with Medal of Honor Heroes 1 and 2 on the PSP. Fuck. Now after this, we're going handheld again with Medal of Honor Heroes 1 and 2 on the PSP, both of which are more or less just European Assault, heavily stripped back to work within the limitations of a gaming platform you can play on the toilet. Heroes 1 was developed by Team Fusion, and I cannot find any information about these guys online, with Heroes 2 again being developed by EA Los Angeles. The heroes in the title come from the fact that you're playing as protagonists from some of the previous games.
This is the file for Sergeant John Baker. He's a recent OSS recruit, currently serving in Italy as part of Operation Avalanche.
And eventually, even Jimmy Patterson himself.
He's a fucking liability.
The first game is broken down into 5 missions split across the 3 campaigns for each character, with again a bunch of main and side objectives to complete. The side objectives involving just finding some kind of document that's got a giant icon above it. Yeah, not super hard to complete or likely to make your brain explode, but look, if nothing else, it makes more than just running around the levels in autopilot mode. Now for a PSP game, it does seem kind of unfair to criticize how this whole thing looks, but what I can do is criticize just how repetitive the missions are. Most of these feel like you're playing a domination map where you've got to hold and capture all these various points around the environment. You quite literally just stand in one spot until you've captured a point, before then running off to the next one and doing it all over again. And they recycle this mission format about 7 or 8 times throughout the entire game. I mean, this kind of mode is fine for a multiplayer experience, but in a single-player campaign, it just feels so unwholesome. Other times you might need to hold a single point, and this is as simple as just standing in one spot for like 5 or so minutes until a timer in the top right of the screen fills up, and I think it'd be more fun at this point standing outside and watching dog turds drive. There's also just not that much variety to the weapons, and 90% of the time here you'll be either using the Thompson or the MP40. A couple of times you get an M1 Garand or a bar, but that's about it. And yeah, I get that they're staples of the genre, but it's like, where's the STG-44, the Kar 98K, or the Enfield rifle? Visually, again, there is variety, and I actually think some of the later missions look really good, you know, especially the ones set in snow. Yeah, surprise, surprise. But it's a super short game, like roughly 2 or so hours long. And I just can't think of any reason why you'd want to play this, unless you've got like a 2-hour car ride to sit through or need to take a 2-hour-long shit. But honestly, if you're taking 2-hour-long shits, well, you might want to go and see a doctor. Heroes 2, on the other hand, is really just more of the same, only this time instead of being split up between 3 characters in different countries, you're just playing as one guy the entire time named John Berg.
Did you hand in your assignment, Mr. Berg?
With 9 missions instead of 15. Probably the biggest change with this one is the regenerating health, which is the first time they've ever used that mechanic in the series. And I swear too, man, that developers think putting regenerating health in video games gives them free reign to just make things as irritating as possible. And Heroes 2 is just full of these bullshit sequences where you get gunned down so quickly. Sometimes you can literally see the enemies spawning right in front of you, like some ancient cosmic deities, throwing them into your dimension to upset the fabric of reality or something. The one consolation here is that they have included mid-mission checkpoints, which reduces the bullshit-o-meter from like an 8 down to a 6 or a 7. But again, there's just not that much variety to any of the gunplay. You'll have your hands glued to an MP40 or a Thompson most of the time, both of which have frustratingly slow reload times. It also has an MG42, which I think might have the worst bullet spread I've ever seen in any video game. I mean, it's like I'm shooting a goddamn water sprinkler. Along with the slowest turning artillery gun in the history of, well, everything. I mean, I think it'd actually be faster to rotate an artillery gun in real life. The biggest fault both these games have, though, isn't even really their fault, and that's the PSP itself. Now look, it's a scientific fact that console shooters work best with 2 thumbsticks, but anyone who knows the PSP layout knows you only get 1 thumbstick. This means while you can use the thumbstick to move around, you've got to use the face buttons to turn left and right and aim up and down. And it's just a super clunky control scheme in an already super clunky game. Sony eventually learned their lesson with the Vita years later, but this game is a testament to how that control scheme just doesn't work. So overall, not amazing games and not particularly fun or smooth to control, but I guess somewhat acceptable considering the platform they were built for. Are they bad? No. Would I recommend them? Again, no. However, that all completely changes if you're playing Heroes 2 on the Wii.
Make some for us!
A version which was released a few months after the PSP, and in comparison is like playing a completely different game. I'd actually heard about this version before I'd even played it on the PSP, with a bunch of people telling me that this was the worst game in the entire series, but after having finished it, I just have to ask those people what were they smoking, because as far as I'm concerned, like, I thought this was one of the better ones. Not only does it look considerably better on the Wii running at 480p, that rhymes, but it also plays a lot smoother, running around 60 FPS most of the time, and just feeling seamless with the Wii controller. They removed the sprinting mechanic from the PSP version, but instead increased your base movement speed, making the whole thing feel less lethargic. It's also one of those rare Wii games that manages to use the gimmick of the control setup properly, making you perform movements that make sense for what you're trying to do. So for instance, when firing a machine gun, you have to use 2 hands to aim it around, you know, as if you're actually using your hands to grab both handles. When firing the bazooka, you put the motion controller over your shoulder, like an actual bazooka. And that awful section rotating that artillery gun is now way better, because you can spin the gun much quicker if you rotate the nunchuck faster. Even something as simple as the sniper scope has you rotating the controller left or right, as if you're adjusting the zoom ring on the side of the scope. When throwing grenades, you get a helpful marker which shows exactly where the grenade is going to land, making this whole thing just effortless. And that's super handy, considering throwing grenades in these kind of games has often felt like cold shit. It just shows you how actually thinking about how to work in the controls for the mechanics of a game like this can have a huge impact on how the whole thing plays. And yeah, right, keep that statement in mind for when we talk about Vanguard later on. The best inclusion though is a new weapon in the form of a shotgun, and this thing, the 2 or 3 times you get it, tears absolute ass. And look, if you're gonna do one thing right in a first-person shooter, it's making damn sure that the shotgun turns the player into an absolute force of nature. Speaking of the weapons too, this version lets you carry 2 primary weapons, whereas on the PSP you could only carry 1 and a sidearm. But I think the best addition is being able to play through the entire campaign in an on-rails mode like you're playing a coin-sucking arcade version of the same game. Now you can use the controller like a light gun to aim around the screen and shoot at enemies, along with shooting at medkits to restore your health points, and this whole mode actually works pretty well. The Wii actually had some really solid rail shooters, and this mode is a cool addition to what I think is an underappreciated genre for the platform. About all they messed up here was that with the Australian version of the game, EA didn't include a multiplayer mode. The belief there apparently was that it was because Aussie servers wouldn't have been cost effective or something, so they just didn't bother. And yeah, imagine that, right? EA fucking up the multiplayer component for one of their games. That's a first. That was sarcasm, by the way. All in all, this just feels like the best way to play the game, and kind of makes the PSP version redundant. You'll still get your ass handed to you in nanoseconds because they still haven't really cracked how to address the broken enemy damage. But damn dog, this is a far sight better than the original version, and something I actively wanted to play through. However, that all pales in comparison to what came next with the Medal of Honor Vanguard, which is really just a crappier version of Airborne, and a game that was developed for the Wii and then oddly an outright irrelevant platform at that point with the dwindling PlayStation 2. You have to keep in mind that this one came out when the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were a thing, and for a game to come out on the PS2 at that point and not even the GameCube or the Xbox is just a downright oddity. Plus, we're 10-something games in now, and it's another entry in a series which really hasn't had any kind of innovation since its inception. In Vanguard, you're playing as Sergeant Frank Keegan, a member of the 82nd Airborne Division, though you'd hardly know it because this guy jumps out of a grand total of 3 planes in the entire game. And you'll be taking part in some pretty pivotal campaigns though, all of which were also featured in Airborne, with Operation Husky, Neptune, Market Garden, and Varsity. You get very little control though over where you land during these sections, and although they do look interesting and impressive visually, you'll come to realise that once you land, it's more or less just the same old shit. And the fact this game looks worse off than its predecessor makes the whole thing even more depressing.
Fire from multiple positions!
What's kind of wild to me too is that somehow the PS2 version looks better than the Wii version does, which it really shouldn't considering the Wii technically has more power under that little white hood. I do think some of the lighting effects look kinda neat in certain areas, but for a 2007 game to look like this is just insulting. It's actually a good example of why I hate the technological complacency that Nintendo has with their consoles, and a full price game looking like this, you know, the same year the PS3 and the 360 were on the scene, is really a step backwards, you know what I mean? Like, people paid money to play this.
That's it! This battery's ours!
That Wii version might have had some merit too, playing with the nunchuck and the motion controller, only the game controls like complete shit, and it doesn't feel like any thought's gone into it at all. I mean, for instance, to reload guns, you move the nunchuck to the right. Like, to the right?
Stay to the right!
But then to do a quick 180 spin, you move the nunchuck to the left. And half the time, I ended up spinning around by accident when I was trying to reload because of how inconsistent this is. It's actually a good follow-up to the point I made earlier when I was talking about Heroes 2. And that's how, like, a little common sense when integrating the controls into a game like this can have a huge impact. Though in Vanguard's defense, it did come out before Heroes 2 did, so at least as a consolation, they seem to learn from their past mistakes. So opting to play it on the PS2 with that DualShock controller, you're just going to find a mechanically dated and clunky shooter that often feels worse to play than even the previous games in the series. It just kind of feels like the whole thing has input delay, and even with a new sprint button, it's like you're walking around with an anvil in your pants the whole time. 99% of the gunplay here is just trading shots with enemies you hide behind cover the whole time, and what's most annoying is how, again, ammo and weapons disappear from corpses if you don't pick them up quickly enough. And I just don't get why they've done this again. Fucking Wolfenstein 3D, man, back in 1992 had the capabilities to let weapon and ammo pickups remain. So why can't a game like this manage it 15-something years later? You know, if you can answer that question, please enlighten me. You want to know what this results in? Yeah, you guessed it. Again, bugger all ammo. So it's another campaign where it's like there's some kind of bullet shortage and you have to make sure every shot counts. Honestly, I'd be fine with this if the combat seemed to facilitate it, but you're still playing the part of the one-man army. And a one-man army who's running low on ammo, that ain't a fun title to have. Honestly, just grab that MP40 as soon as you can and sit on that thing for the entire campaign. It'll be about as boring as watching snails fuck, but at least you'll have ammo for the damn thing. Checkpoints are also incredibly inconsistent, and it's again a lot like Heroes 1 and 2, where you get gunned down in seconds, which means you'll be replaying large sections over and over. There's this half-cocked mechanic of being able to upgrade your weapons, giving the Thompson a drum mag for instance, but you can only upgrade the Thompson and the M1. And these upgrades are only available in a handful of levels, plus they don't even carry over to ensuing missions. Okay. But the worst thing by far is yet again your buddies, and yeah, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but these guys still get in your way constantly and obscure your vision.
Hello.
And they always take cover in the kind of spots where you want to take cover, and it's impossible to get them to move either. Overall, it's just not a very enjoyable game to play through, and I think I'd have more fun being waterboarded with cat piss. There is a reason why this is one of the lowest scored games in the entire series. So if you're one of those poor souls who unwrapped this thing for Christmas or an ill-fated birthday, look, I know it's not that much all these years later, but let me give you my condolences. Because I can only imagine the amount of effort it took to feign happiness when you realise you'd been gifted this piece of shit.
You got me. Oh yeah.
All I can say is thank God that Medal of Honor Airborne came out that same year to salvage what little credibility the series still had left. Because Vanguard could have easily been the final sad nail in the coffin otherwise.
We gotta hold him off!
Airborne was released in late 2007, and it's unique for a couple of key reasons. Firstly, it marks the first console generation leap that the series has had in almost a decade, with it being released for the 7th generation consoles. And it's really the kind of game that could have only come out at that point in the industry on an engine like Unreal Engine 3, because not only does that allow for a much more cinematic presentation, but it also allows for bigger capabilities when it comes to the size of these environments, working in tandem with the whole premise of being a paratrooper jumping out of a plane and landing on the ground in real time. Oh yeah, and that's the second thing, right? Being able to jump out of a plane at the beginning of each mission. Actually jump out of a plane and choose where to land and in what order to tackle your objectives. It's like the culmination of every mechanic the series has had up until this point, all combined into one neat little package. Plus it also gets rid of straight up regenerating health using a combination of fixed and regenerating, forcing you to work within the limitations of medkits to make the game more tactical, and less about sprinting around like a dickless chicken. The whole thing opens with this training mission as you're being told the basics of parachuting, and one of the very first things you see is this large expansive airfield where dozens if not hundreds of other paratroopers are also in training. It's a stunning backdrop and almost like a bit of a flex by the devs I think to showcase just how much more of a grand scale this game's on. This time you're playing as Boyd Travers and each mission begins with you and your buddies inside a plane which often gets shot to shit.
Who's shooting at us?
Before you're then just thrown out under incredible duress and forced to quickly get your bearings. Once you make your ideally greased landing, you're off on your way and then completing the mission, taking part in some of the more notable operations from that era. Probably the coolest thing I think is how you can now essentially level up all of the weapons. By getting kills with a gun, you're basically earning XP and eventually you can unlock 3 upgrades for every single gun in the game. From something as simple as a bigger magazine for the Thompson or a grenade launcher attachment for the rifles. It encourages experimenting with all the different weapons and prevents you from just sitting on the M1 or the MP40 the entire time. The best by far here again I think is the STG-44, and this might be one of my favourite versions of it in any game. When fully upgraded, it gets improved accuracy, faster reload times, and a tactical scope. I mean, damn. This game, along with Vanguard, also marked the return of Michael Giacchino composing the music. And compared to the other games, which just kind of felt like he was using the same motifs and tracks over and over, Airborne really does feel like it's doing its own thing. The first track in the game is easily one of the most memorable and definitely makes that opening sequence that much more impressive. It just captures the feeling of heroism and courage in a series that's been lacking that for a long time.
Vertical envelopment, troopers. Death from above.
One of my other favourite things was those short little segments of radio chat you got in between the next mission, and just something as simple as hearing banter that doesn't feel forced adds some much needed charm into a franchise that was really on its last legs.
Hey Jimmy, you think this is our last flight?
I sure hope so.
You don't sound confident.
One thing about the Nazis, they don't give up so easily.
He's right, you know.
I think the main issue this one has is that it starts to detour away from historical accuracy towards the end of the campaign and feeling more like you're playing a Wolfenstein game instead of Medal of Honor. Enemies in the game are given a combat rating from 1 to 10, with 1 being pretty much useless and then 10 being death on 2 legs. The lower level enemies are just guys armed with MP40s or STG-44s, you know, the kind of thing you're probably used to by that point. They'll throw grenades, they'll retreat when under fire, you know, basic stuff like that. But then the final couple of enemies you come up against are guys wearing gas masks, armed with rocket launchers and hip-firing MG42s like it's nothing. In fact, those guys with the MG42 can survive multiple headshots, and it all kind of reminds me of the Venom Troopers from Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Just feels a little bit out of place in this series. The final mission is set inside a flak tower, which were these giant imposing structures that the Nazis built to defend cities like Berlin. And yeah, I know they're historically accurate, as in, you know, they existed in real life, but the size and scale of the ones in the game feel like something that have been greatly exaggerated to make them more grandiose and epic for the sake of the gameplay. And that's all fine and dandy. I mean, I have no problem with that, but yeah, it's quite a bit different to slowly moving through the French countryside with a Springfield rifle, isn't it? It's also a really short game, probably one of the shortest in the franchise, coming in at around 3 or so hours, which, you know, probably didn't help its reception either. But you know what, I'd still take a tightly crafted 3 to 4 hour long campaign over like a 7 to 8 hour long one, and besides, you can only shoot so many people in the face with an M1 Garand before it does start to become a bit repetitive. Kind of like how I imagine this video is starting to feel by this point.
The fuck is that?
Overall, I think Airborne is a solid shooter, and it's probably my favourite in the entire series. Not to mention it's the one that marked the end of the World War II era for the franchise. And that's not really by choice either, more just the way the industry was moving at the time, and a big reason for that was a game that came out that same year.
Jump for it!
Yeah, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, you might have heard of it. And if there was a more decisive title that marked the end of the World War II genre for first-person shooters, well, I can't think of it.
He's right, you know.
More than that, it's also a turning point for every other military FPS game being set in modern or near-future settings from that point on. And the Medal of Honor series would try to keep up with this trend with a bit of a reboot for the series with Medal of Honor, yeah, just Medal of Honor, and then Medal of Honor Warfighter in 2012. Getting you out of Europe and the Pacific Theatre and putting you into a modern day setting in Afghanistan, playing as Special Forces soldiers and fighting the Taliban.
Get down!
For the first game, you're mostly playing as a Navy SEAL member called Rabbit. Yeah, Rabbit. Yeah, it really helps the whole power fantasy element when you're playing as a highly trained soldier named after a cute and fluffy rodent.
Fuck you.
The thing is though, this game kind of came out a couple of years too late for its own good. This is the kind of game that really would have done a lot better had it come out in the mid-2000s, because that would have made it smack bang in the middle of the Bush administration, when the war in the Middle East against the Taliban was still really at the forefront of relevancy. But by 2010, Barack Obama had become president, and that whole premise of fighting insurgents in deserts and caves in the Middle East just seemed kinda dated. I mean, by that point we'd had Modern Warfare 1 and 2, and they'd even tried to shake things up a bit with Black Ops by going back to the 1960s. Plus, that same year we had Metro 2033, Fallout New Vegas, and even things like Raven Software's Singularity. So a game about just shooting Middle Eastern terrorists, even though that was new for the series, was, on the other hand, just kinda behind the times. Then by the time Warfighter rolled around a couple of years later, it was even worse. What's not helping either is that Medal of Honor takes its story very seriously. There's not really any room for light-hearted humour or levity. It's this oddly intense journey jumping back and forth between these various characters.
Colonel, you're not hearing me, and I want to be very clear on this point. I am giving you 24 hours to get our forces into that valley.
See, nobody cares.
And it's all just kinda mindless as you move through these highly linear levels, shooting the same looking enemies over and over with whatever assault rifle the game's given you. Seems they couldn't decide if they wanted to make the shooting tactical or run and gun, so they opted for both. So you can lean left and right, crouch and go prone, but then leave behind the kind of body count you'd expect to see in an old action movie from the 1980s. But then annoyingly, you still get dropped like a bag of shit if you so much as look in the general direction of nearby gunfire. To keep things interesting, Medal of Honor takes a page out of Call of Duty's playbook and swaps between all these characters constantly. It even has one mission where you're the pilot of an Apache chopper, blowing up mortar teams and shooting dudes as they come running out of caves.
Great burn, the position is destroyed.
And look, I guess on that note, it's not all bad. Like, there are some cool moments here and there. One mission has you hunkering down inside a stone hut that's being slowly blown away by these constantly approaching enemy forces. And eventually during this whole sequence, your squad basically accepts their fate and comes to grips with the realization that they're probably going to be overrun and killed.
Bravo 6, Bravo 1-6. Hold your men. We aren't gonna make it. We're out of ammo and the enemy is closing in.
It's a grim and hopeless moment, capturing how futile the war can often be. But yeah, of course you're saved in the nick of time as air support shows up and just scorches the earth. Otherwise, it's just a campaign that you practically play in autopilot, running around shooting bad guys as they pop up from behind buildings like targets in a carnival shooting gallery. There's never any threat of running out of ammo either, because you can just ask your squad mates for more ammo at any time. It comes from that era where the player isn't allowed to interact with anything until they're given the go-ahead. That means other people have to open doors for you or pull you up ledges. Because, yeah, apparently a special forces soldier can't even lift his own body weight. And again, the whole thing is super short, coming in at around 3 or so hours. About the best thing it has going for it is the visuals, with some really good looking environments, effects, and lighting. It's kind of funny to me too how the campaign runs in a really early iteration of the Unreal Engine 3, and yet I'd argue that it looks better than most Unreal Engine 4 games we get in the current day. The only problem is that FOV, which is super low, and if there's one thing I can't stand, aside from chemical warfare and TikTok thoughts, it's low FOVs, let me tell ya.
How's our imagery miss this shit?
What's kind of cool though is that the music was composed by the same guy who did the music for, among other things, the first Iron Man film and the theme for Game of Thrones. But it all just feels like a bit of a play-by-play of what they thought they needed to do to compete with the popularity of the Call of Duty series. And it's kind of sad, man, that a franchise which really helped pioneer the military shooter genre is now desperately just trying to stay relevant. The sequence where you first use your night vision goggles for the first time is the classic example, knocking out the power and then going through this pitch black building like your Buffalo Bill and taking out these incapacitated enemies. It's exactly the same as a similar level that Modern Warfare had 3 years prior.
These night vision goggles make it.
By the time Warfighter came out 2 years later in 2012, at that point, the whole thing was like Weekend at Bernie's, hauling around the carcass of a dead franchise to try to pretend it still has some life left. Playing through Warfighter's campaign again for this video has to be just one of the most boring experiences I've had in recent memory. And my main takeaway is that out of all the video games ever made, I can definitely confirm that Warfighter is one of them.
What the fuck?
Once again, you're trying to stop the Taliban, this time from smuggling high quantities of a super potent explosive called Pent. And seeing as they killed off Rabbit in the previous game, sorry spoilers, you're now playing as Preacher, one of the other members of that original squad. And along with the central story involving the terrorists, they've shoehorned in this lame side plot about Preacher's strained relationship with his wife and daughter. And can I just say right here and now how much I fucking hate this trope. It always seems to be for characters in these kind of roles as well. Like whenever someone's a detective or a soldier or doing some kind of a job that benefits the general population, it's like they always have to include some unsympathetic spouse on the sidelines who puts their own personal issues above the greater good. I mean, yeah, let's totally ignore the incredible sacrifice this guy's making because he didn't make it home that one time to cook dinner or wash the dishes. And how does his daughter somehow look both 12 and 70 years old at the same time?
God damn!
Apart from some unintentionally laughable moments here, the story is also just completely forgettable.
English, asshole! We know you speak it!
English, motherfucker! Do you speak it?
Just kind of exists to explain why you're going from point A to point B. On a positive note though, this is one of the earliest games to use DICE's Frostbite engine, and it still definitely holds up in that regard. In fact, I think even by today's standards, there's environments here that just look amazing. The lighting in some of these areas is just gorgeous, and there's some fantastic environmental effects as well. One mission is set in the Philippines during some kind of world-ending monsoon, and this whole area just looks amazing. Did I say amazing before? The trees all sway violently in the wind, you're dealing with this raging torrent of floodwater, and all these buildings and structures seem to crumble around you. There's a car chase through Pakistan where you're crashing through market stalls and narrowly avoiding oncoming traffic, and this just looks insane, especially considering it came out in 2012.
Pants and burgers. Yeah, lots of space in this mall.
And then a later mission again featuring a car chase in Dubai perfectly captures the grossly decadent backdrop of that city. Yeah, it's a damn good looking game, man, and it scales really well for modern hardware. It's just a shame that the rest of the gameplay is so boring to the point that it could cure insomnia. I mean, this really is about as soulless as a shooter can ever get, with the combat loop being little more than just running around, shooting people, hiding if you're injured, and then just repeating until the whole thing comes to an end. The cover system does work pretty well, I will admit, but there's really nothing exciting about it in any other way. And you'll just sit on whatever assault rifle the mission gives you for 90% of the campaign. And again, because they still haven't decided what kind of game they want to make, you get mowed down in nanoseconds by enemy gunfire. There's a new door breaching system where you can choose how you want to enter certain rooms from like half a dozen or so different options, but this is really just for show because it doesn't even seem to matter which one you go with, the end result is always the same. So yeah, what a pisser. Ultimately, this is the game that really killed off the Medal of Honor franchise. And from this point on, EA put all of their chips onto the Battlefield series, which now to make us all feel even older, has now also kind of run its course too. Regardless of how things ended up though, Medal of Honor still has its place in the industry and was still one of the most influential franchises of all time. Some people look back fondly on their campaigns, for others it was the multiplayer. Either way though, these games have had a profound effect on countless lives throughout the years. For me, I'll always remember sitting on the computer in my dad's office, making my way up the beach in Allied Assault, or the first time I loaded up Frontline for my PS2. I still get the occasional itch to go back and mow down Germans with a Sten submachine gun in Underground, and I also often want to jump out of a plane with an M1 Garand in Airborne. Now, I'm aware I'm skipping out on Medal of Honor above and beyond, but lately VR games have made me want to barf up the entire contents of my stomach, so maybe that's something for a future video. Plus, as far as I've been told, that game's also pretty damn awful, and we've got enough of those kind of games in this video to begin with.
He's right, you know.
Folks might not talk about every game lovingly in the same way, but they'll talk about them regardless. And for a franchise to still have relevancy going on 2 decades later is a testament to the impact that it had on all of us. If nothing else, still the only games that let you shoot German shepherds armed with assault rifles or ride an elephant that's decked out with machine guns. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the